The cafeteria was alive with its usual chaos, a mixture of clattering trays, the screech of chair legs on tile, and the relentless chatter of teenagers who thought themselves the center of the world. Steam rose from metal bins where food sat waiting to be scooped, a haze of heat and aroma wrapping itself around the room. In the middle of it all, she moved with quiet efficiency, her hands steady as she slid ladles of stew into plastic trays. She had been here long enough that she could predict what each kid would say before the words even left their mouths. "Yo, look, it's the queen of mystery meat!" One boy shouted as she set his portion down, his voice carrying above the clamor. His friends doubled over in laughter, nudging each other, as if the insult had been a masterpiece of comedy. The boy smirked, waiting for her to react, waiting for the flicker of anger or shame he thought would make it worth the cruelty. But all he received was silence. She glanced at him, just for a moment, her expression calm, unbothered, as if his words had been no more than a fly buzzing past. They laughed harder at that. The joke wasn't just about the food. It was about her, her uniform, her apron with faint stains no wash cycle could erase, the worn sneakers she wore from hours of standing. To them, she was part of the scenery, an invisible worker who existed only to serve them, a woman whose life began and ended behind the counter. They didn't know her name, and they didn't care. She was the lunch lady. Nothing more. Yet there was something about the way she carried herself, her spine straight, her eyes sharp even when her lips stayed closed, that made it impossible to fully dismiss her. She seemed to carry a weight, a kind of presence that didn't belong to someone small or insignificant. But in the cafeteria, surrounded by noise and ridicule, that presence was easy to overlook. That day, however, something unusual broke the rhythm. It came in the form of a sharp tone crackling through the old speakers mounted on the wall. The laughter cut off mid-note, trays paused halfway to mouths as the announcement echoed across the room. "Attention students! Due to an urgent situation, all math classes will report to the auditorium immediately." The cafeteria grew restless. Confused chatter replaced the laughter. Forks clinked nervously against trays. Even the teachers on lunch duty frowned, whispering questions to each other. The voice came again, more insistent. "This is mandatory. All students are to proceed now." Chairs scraped as hundreds of teenagers rose at once, filing out with a mix of groans and curiosity. The buzz of speculation filled the hallways. Something big was happening, something out of the ordinary. She watched them go, her hands busy stacking trays, her mind registering the shift in atmosphere the way a seasoned sailor feels a storm on the horizon. By the time she rolled her cart of clean utensils toward the back, the auditorium was already filling. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the polished floor, the air humming with unease. Students clustered together in groups, whispering guesses. Teachers lined the sides, their faces drawn with concern. On the stage stood the principal, stiff as if holding himself together with effort, flanked by 3 strangers in dark suits, school board members, their expressions tight and disapproving. The principal adjusted his tie, his hand trembling slightly at the microphone. "Students, faculty," he began, his voice wavering. "We've just received the results of the state's Advanced Placement Challenge exam." He paused, his throat working as though the words weighed too much. "None of our students passed the final section. Not one." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Shock gave way to nervous murmurs. The weight of failure hung heavy in the air, pressing down on every seat in the room. The principal's voice grew softer, as if he wanted to disappear. "This has never happened in our district's history. The board has made it clear that our funding is at risk if we cannot prove our students are capable." One of the board officials, tall and sharp-featured, stepped forward with disdain etched into his face. "Your brightest minds failed spectacularly. If no one in this building can solve the problem, then perhaps this school has been wasting the taxpayers' money." The challenge was scrawled across a massive chalkboard wheeled onto the stage. An equation stretched from one corner to the other, a jungle of symbols, numbers, and notations that looked almost alien in its complexity. The sight of it alone drew groans from the students, some clutching their heads, others muttering defeat before even trying. "It's impossible. No one can do that." What even is that? The board member's smirk widened as the hopelessness spread. He folded his arms, enjoying the spectacle. The teachers exchanged helpless glances. They had no answers to offer, no solution to present. The auditorium pulsed with dread, the future of the school balanced on a problem none of them could even begin to touch. And through the side door, unnoticed, she entered, pushing her cart of stacked trays for the staff's lunch. The wheels squeaked softly against the polished floor as she maneuvered into the shadow of the stage. No one turned to look at her. No one thought twice about her presence. She was invisible here, as always. But her eyes, sharp and steady, flicked up to the chalkboard. She paused. Her cart stilled. For a moment she stared, her brow furrowing, not with confusion but with recognition. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her gaze traced the sprawl of symbols the way a musician reads notes on a page. The students sat frozen in their seats, the staff powerless, the board smug and ready to condemn. And there she was, standing at the edge of the stage, her apron faintly dusted with flour, her hand still resting on the handle of the cart, staring at the equation that had silenced an entire school. No one noticed yet. No one realized that in the midst of despair, the woman they dismissed as nothing more than a lunch lady had already begun to see the cracks in the impossible. Would you like me to continue part 2 in the same style, around 1,000 words of flowing narrative? Or would you prefer I first expand part 1 further with even more build-up and detail? The room pulsed with restless silence, the kind that makes every cough, every shuffle of a shoe echo louder than it should. On the stage, the chalkboard loomed like a sentence of doom, its white scrawls twisting into something monstrous in the eyes of the students who stared at it with dread. Nobody even tried to raise a hand. They were too afraid of looking foolish, too afraid of being the next target of ridicule when the truth was that every one of them had already surrendered before the battle began. The board members looked at one another with smug satisfaction, as though they had known this would happen all along. Their smirks cut through the air like blades, enjoying the humiliation of the principal and his staff. She was still standing near the cart, her gaze fixed on the problem. The clamor of defeat swirled around her but didn't touch her. Her fingers flexed slightly, a habit she'd carried since her younger days, when chalk dust clung to her skin like a second layer. She knew that structure, that rhythm of numbers. She saw not a wall but a pattern, messy, yes, layered and deliberately tangled, but still a pattern she could unravel if given the chance. A voice cut through the tension, sharp with desperation. "Surely one of you can attempt it?" The principal's eyes darted over the students seated before him. "Even a start would show effort." But the students avoided his gaze. One boy muttered, "I'm not getting up there to make a fool of myself." His friend laughed nervously. "Man, it looks like alien language." "Forget it." A teacher tried to encourage a few of the top students, whispering for them to try, but they shook their heads stubbornly. Then, as if pulled from her stillness by something stronger than pride, she spoke. Her voice was soft but steady, clear enough to carry through the anxious quiet. "Numbers don't lie," she said, each word distinct. "People just stop looking too soon." For a moment, no one reacted, as though the room hadn't registered where the voice had come from. Then heads turned. The crowd shifted, craning their necks. And when they saw who had spoken, laughter erupted. "You're kidding, right?" one student blurted, clutching his sides. "The lunch lady?" His friend nearly fell out of his chair, wheezing with laughter. "Yo, she thinks she's about to save us with mashed potato math." Even a few teachers chuckled under their breath, trying to cover it as nervous laughter. A girl in the front row rolled her eyes so hard it seemed they might stick. "Please, you don't even belong here. Go back to serving slop." The words struck like arrows, but her expression did not change. She stepped forward, each stride slow but sure, the click of her worn sneakers echoing against the wooden stage floor. The chalkboard's glare reflected in her dark, steady eyes. One of the board members barked out a derisive laugh. "This is absurd. What's next? You'll ask the janitor to conduct a physics lecture? Let her try, principal. Perhaps the embarrassment will finally wake this school up to its failures." The principal stammered, unsure. Miss Laverne, this isn't. But she had already reached the board. With deliberate calm, she set down the tray she carried and picked up a piece of chalk. Her hands bore the faint calluses of work, but the grip was steady, practiced, the way only someone familiar with long hours at a board could hold it. She did not look at the audience. She did not flinch at the laughter. She simply faced the problem. The chalk hovered near the first line of numbers, trembling slightly not from fear but from the faint tremor age brings. Then it touched the surface. A squeak rang out. She began to write. At first, her movements were slow, careful, as though reacquainting herself with a language she hadn't spoken in years. The first few symbols appeared, small and deliberate. Students snickered. She doesn't even know what she's doing. Someone whispered. Watch, she's gonna get stuck in like 2 seconds. But then the rhythm changed. Her hand picked up speed. The chalk's movements became fluid, precise, confident. The crowd's laughter faltered. Equations unfolded line after line, breaking the impossible problem into smaller, simpler pieces. She was stripping away the noise, dismantling the clutter designed to confuse. One teacher leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Wait, she's factoring it down. Another whispered back. No, she's finding the hidden sequence. Slowly, a murmur spread. The kids who had laughed the loudest now fell silent, watching as the supposed impossibility began to collapse into something they could almost follow. She muttered under her breath, not for them but for herself. They layered it to intimidate. But patterns don't disappear. You just have to know where to look. The chalk flew faster. Equations balanced, one after another. Steps connected like notes in a symphony, each resolving into the next. The room had gone completely silent now, except for the rasp of chalk against slate. Some students leaned forward in their chairs, their eyes wide, their earlier smirks erased. A girl whispered, She's actually doing it. On the stage, the board members' smug expressions began to falter. One shifted uncomfortably, whispering to his colleague, This isn't possible. She's not even faculty. The other hissed back. Then explain what's happening. Her breathing stayed steady, her movements fluid, until finally she drew the last line, the last calculation that tied everything together. The chalk tapped the board with a faint click as she underlined the final answer. Then she stepped back, dusting her hands slowly, letting the white powder fall to the floor like snow. The answer stood complete, neat, and undeniable. For a long moment, the auditorium was frozen. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. Then the silence shattered. Gasps broke out. A boy shouted, She solved it! A girl clapped her hands to her mouth, stunned. Teachers exchanged looks of disbelief, some with tears springing to their eyes at the sight of what had just unfolded. The principal stared as if he had seen a ghost, his lips forming words that refused to come out. And she? She simply placed the chalk back on the ledge of the board, her face calm, unshaken, as though she had just done something ordinary. As though this were no miracle, just logic laid bare. The students who had mocked her earlier slouched in their seats, shame burning red on their faces. A teacher muttered under his breath, 20 years, she's been here 20 years and none of us knew. The auditorium trembled with energy, with disbelief, with awe. But under it all was the same question, unspoken but loud in every heart. Who was this woman they had dismissed all their lives, and how had she just done the impossible? Would you like me to continue with Part 3 in the same cinematic 1,000-word expansion, keeping dialogue sharp and tension high, or expand this part even further before moving on? The chalk rested on the ledge, her hand lowering slowly as if releasing the weight of years that had lain dormant. The board behind her glowed white with order out of chaos, the tangled mass now reduced to neat lines and a single, undeniable answer. For a moment it felt as though time itself had paused, the auditorium suspended in disbelief. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not even a whisper stirred the air. Hundreds of eyes bore into her back, students and teachers alike struggling to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with what they had just witnessed. Then sound returned all at once, a wave of voices crashing forward. Students muttered in astonishment, some gasped audibly, and a handful clapped before catching themselves. A boy near the middle rows leaned forward, his voice breaking as he whispered, "She did it! She actually did it!" The laughter that had filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by something heavier, shame, awe, confusion all tangled together. The board members no longer smirked. One had his arms crossed so tightly it seemed he might snap a rib, while another adjusted his glasses over and over, unable to keep them still. The tallest one, the one who had mocked the schools so freely, stared with a growing unease that stripped away his earlier confidence. "Impossible," he muttered under his breath. "There's no way she—" But the answer on the board was undeniable, standing there in clean chalk as proof. The principal's mouth opened, but no words came. He stood frozen, his hands trembling at his sides. For years he had walked past her in the cafeteria without more than a nod. Now he looked as though he had just discovered a hidden chapter of the school's history that had been waiting silently in plain sight. The students shifted in their seats, restless under the weight of what they had seen. The ones who had jeered loudest at her during lunch were now hunched low, their laughter drained, their faces red. The silence that wrapped around them was not empty but thick with guilt. A girl bit her lip, whispering, "We made fun of her." Her friend gave no reply, staring only at the floor. She turned then, facing the crowd, her eyes sweeping over them. They were sharp but not cruel, carrying the weight of someone who had been dismissed and overlooked but had never once let it define her. The murmurs faltered under her gaze. She did not need to speak yet. The silence she commanded now was enough to hold every ear. The board chair cleared his throat, struggling to regain control. "This doesn't prove anything," he snapped. "Anyone can scribble numbers on a board. Where is the verification? Where is the proof that this is correct?" Before anyone else could respond, one of the math teachers, Mr. Alvarez, a man known for his meticulous nature, rose from his seat. He pushed his glasses up and walked toward the stage. The tension in the room thickened with each step. The board members leaned forward, ready to pounce on any error. The students watched wide-eyed, knowing that his word would mean everything. Mr. Alvarez studied the board carefully, tracing each line with his finger, lips moving as he checked the logic. His brow furrowed, then relaxed, then furrowed again. Minutes dragged like hours as he examined the entire solution. At last, he dropped his hand, exhaling a long, shaky breath. "It's correct," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. "Every step. Every single line. She solved it perfectly." The auditorium erupted. Applause thundered, shouts echoed, some students stood in disbelief, clapping before they even realized what they were doing. The principal's jaw dropped, his relief flooding out in a laugh that sounded almost hysterical. "We are school." He stopped, unable to finish as the sound swallowed his words. But she didn't bask in the noise. Her face remained calm, as if she had expected no less of herself. She dusted her hands together, the chalk residue falling like pale dust against her dark apron. For her, it wasn't about applause. It was about truth. A boy near the front row cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Who are you?" It was the question burning in every mind. The board members stiffened, clearly asking themselves the same thing. The tall one sneered, though his voice betrayed unease. "This woman is not qualified. She's not a teacher. She's not even staff of the right department. What gives her the right to make fools of us?" The principal, still shaken, fumbled through papers handed to him by a secretary. He opened a worn personnel file and stopped mid-sentence. His voice trembled as he read aloud. "Before working here, Miss Laverne was a professor of applied mathematics at Howard University. He blinked rapidly, his throat catching. "She left academia 22 years ago after." His voice softened, careful now. "After a personal loss. She requested a quieter life." The revelation hit the auditorium like a shockwave. Students stared at one another in disbelief. Teachers whispered furiously, struggling to process the truth that had been hidden among them all these years. And those who had mocked her most loudly now looked stricken, their faces pale. She stood still, her posture straight, her eyes steady as she looked out over the sea of young faces. Then, for the first time, she spoke directly to them. Her voice was calm but strong, every syllable laced with a weight that quieted the room instantly. You think the world sees you for what you wear, for the job you hold, for the place you stand. But none of that tells the whole story. Respect isn't about the role. It's about the person. And sometimes, the people you dismiss most quickly are the ones who carry the truth you need. Her words cut deep. They weren't scolding, but they struck harder than any reprimand could have. The students sat silent, the weight of their own behavior pressing down on them. The board members shifted, clearly unhappy that the authority in the room had slipped from their hands. One leaned toward the principal. This doesn't change our evaluation. One trick doesn't undo years of mediocrity. But the principal's voice was firm now, steadier than it had been all day. It changes everything. You demanded a solution no one could solve. She solved it. That means our students are not failures. Our school is not a failure. And neither is she. The applause rose again, fierce and unrestrained, echoing against the high ceiling. Students clapped until their hands hurt, some cheering, some even crying without knowing why. The cafeteria worker they had ignored, laughed at, belittled, had just saved them all with a piece of chalk and a mind sharper than any they had ever seen. And yet, as the room roared with admiration, she only turned back to her cart, adjusting a tray as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Her expression softened into the faintest smile, a secret one, as if to say this was never about proving herself. It was simply about showing them what was always there. The story wasn't finished yet. The board members would not let go so easily, but in that moment, the impossible had been shattered. The woman they had all dismissed had revealed her truth, and nothing in that auditorium would ever be the same. Would you like me to flow directly into Part 4 as a full 1,000-word ending with the payoff and poetic justice, or should I expand this moment even more before the resolution? The storm of applause still rang in the auditorium when the board members huddled together, their expressions sour, their whispers sharp and cutting. The students remained on their feet, clapping and cheering until the principal had to raise his hands to calm them. His voice cracked at first, but steadied as he spoke. You all witnessed it. Before your eyes, a problem designed to defeat us was solved. The state cannot deny what was just written on that board. But the board chair was not ready to accept defeat. His face was a mask of resentment, his pride bruised raw. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with disdain. One moment of luck does not change years of mediocrity. This woman is not a teacher, not a faculty member trained for this system. What she did may look impressive to the untrained eye, but the credibility of this institution is not saved by theatrics. Boos rose from the students, but he pressed on. We came here because your brightest students failed. You cannot hide behind a cafeteria worker who scribbled numbers on a board. That is not the solution to your problem. That is smoke and mirrors. The noise in the room turned into angry murmurs, but she did not flinch. She remained at her cart, folding a napkin with steady fingers, her calm presence standing in sharp contrast to the rage that bubbled on stage. She looked up then, her voice steady, carrying above the restless noise. You asked for the problem to be solved. It has been solved. Truth doesn't change because you don't like the hands that revealed it. Her words cut through the haze like a blade. The students cheered again, louder this time, clapping in rhythm, stomping their feet against the auditorium floor. Even teachers joined, their voices rising in defiance of the board's dismissal. The sound became thunderous, a wall of noise that could not be ignored. The principal turned to the officials, his jaw firm now, no longer pleading but resolute. You asked for proof. You have it. If this is not good enough for you, then nothing ever will be. The board chair's mouth opened, but he was drowned out by the eruption of sound that followed. The momentum had shifted entirely, the power in the room no longer his to wield. He sank back, his fury barely contained, as the students stood taller, their eyes bright with newfound pride. One of the teachers stepped forward, his voice thick with awe. For years we've walked past her, never realizing what stood among us. Today she saved not just our funding, but our dignity. His words rippled through the crowd. The shame of their past cruelty weighed heavy on many shoulders. A girl whispered. We called her names. We laughed at her. A boy muttered back. And she still saved us. Their voices carried no laughter now, only regret. She finally stepped away from her cart, walking toward the board one last time. Her gaze swept over the room, over the students who had mocked her, the staff who had overlooked her, and the officials who wanted her silenced. Her voice was calm, even, but it carried the weight of something larger than the walls around them. Do not mistake silence for ignorance. Do not mistake humility for weakness. And never, ever measure worth by the uniform a person wears. Some of the greatest truths are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment they are needed most. Her words settled over them like a final lesson, one that could not be erased from memory. Students bowed their heads. Teachers nodded, their eyes shining. Even the principal stood taller, his respect clear in the way he looked at her now. The board members shifted uncomfortably, knowing they had lost the room entirely. The announcement that followed came not from them, but from the principal himself. His voice was loud, filled with pride. The school is safe. The challenge has been met. And it was not met by pride or arrogance, but by wisdom long overlooked. The cheers returned, shaking the rafters this time, the weight of shame transformed into the fire of inspiration. As the crowd dispersed, clusters of students lingered, their usual chatter replaced with whispers of awe. They stared at her as though seeing her for the first time, their faces flushed with apologies they couldn't yet form into words. She moved back toward her cart with the same quiet grace she had always carried, the cheers and noise trailing behind her like a distant storm. She smiled faintly, barely noticeable, as though the roar of validation was less important than the peace she had always carried within. One of the youngest students, barely in her first year, broke free from the crowd and approached timidly. Ma'am, she said softly, her voice trembling. I'm sorry for how people treated you. I'm sorry for how I treated you. Her eyes were wide with sincerity, with the kind of raw honesty only a child can manage. The lunch lady's stern gaze softened, and she reached out, placing a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. Child, she said, the best apology is to do better when you know better. You have that chance. Don't waste it. The girl nodded quickly, tears shining in her eyes, before hurrying back to her classmates. Word of the exchange spread, another layer of respect growing around the woman who had once been invisible. When the last of the students filed out, when the teachers had returned to their duties and even the board members had left in sour silence, she remained for a moment longer, standing in the quiet aftermath. She looked once more at the chalkboard, the clean white answer underlined with finality. Then she set her hands back on the cart and pushed it forward, the squeak of its wheels echoing in the empty hall. The janitor waiting near the door caught her eye. He gave her a slow nod, the kind of acknowledgement that comes from one invisible worker to another. She returned it with the faintest of smiles before slipping back into the routine of her day. When the next lunch bell rang, students filed into the cafeteria as they always did. But this time, there was no laughter at her expense, no cruel jokes whispered when she passed. They stood straighter, quieter, their eyes carrying respect they had never thought to give. She ladled stew into trays with the same steady rhythm, her hands moving as they always had, but now every student looked at her differently, as though behind the apron and the ladle they saw something greater. She didn't speak of what had happened. She didn't need to. The lesson had already been written, not just on the chalkboard but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. And as the noise of lunch filled the room once more, she allowed herself a small, private thought. They had laughed once, but laughter fades. What remains is truth. She set down a tray, lifted her eyes, and murmured almost to herself, Now, who's ready for dessert? And for the first time, the laughter that answered her wasn't cruel but warm, genuine, the kind that carried no malice but only gratitude. Greatness, she knew, wears no uniform. It doesn't announce itself or beg to be seen. It simply waits, patient and steady, until the world is finally ready to recognize it. Would you like me to now stitch parts 1 to 4 together into one seamless 4,000 plus word cinematic story for YouTube narration, or keep them separated as 4 standalone episodes?